where all you're left with is the sand and gravel that you originally started with. Now you can imagine that's pretty devastating. If you look at these wharfs, all the concrete that's everywhere, if you imagine all these buildings, vertical buildings, foundations, if they were to turn the sand and back to sand and gravel, there's nothing holding them together. And this can be very devastating. Of course, this takes years and years to occur. You have to have a constant source of the sulfate to allow that chemical reaction to occur. So once we see it or start to see it happen, we usually can stop it and repair it. Real quickly, there's two types of chemical of sulfate attack. There's chemical versus physical. Chemical you cannot see, the physical you can. Well, real quickly, here's some examples of physical attack. This is when you're actually looking at the concrete. And it's no longer, concrete oftentimes when it's finished, it's smooth. What happens is the sulfate here is starting to eat away at the surface, or reacting at the surface, and you'll see these pop-outs. The concrete, the cement actually disengaging with the aggregate. You'll see a lot of the exposed aggregate here. So these are kind of some first signs of physical attack. Again, physical is not as bad as chemical. Here we're actually seeing a combination of chemical and physical attack. You can kind of see where the sulfate's kind of getting in, it's discoloring the concrete.
Where is the sulfate coming from? Water from outside?
Yeah, it's usually transported through the concrete via water, and it's usually in the soil. Now some fertilized soils will actually have a lot of sulfate. So if you're planting, and you bring in a lot of planter soils, and some of them will actually have a lot of sulfate, and that can become an issue. Some just natural occurring soils will have them. And what happens if there's a lot of water and water is allowed to flow, it will the sulfates will dissolve in the water, they'll flow through the concrete, and then what happens is when the water gets to the other side or gets out, it says, hey, you know what? I'm tired of being liquid. I am now going to turn into vapor, which water can do. And the water will kind of evaporate at the surface. What happens to the sulfate, the crystals that are in there, they can't. So they kind of get stuck in the concrete. Once they're in the concrete, then they're allowed to react with the concrete, and that's where we, again, have the problems. Oftentimes, we'll see a lot of flowing water issues where water kind of passing through that deals with sulfate. Here you can actually start seeing chemical attack of this sulfate. This is very highly sulfate-containing soils. This is a concrete sidewalk, and you kind of see it starting to migrate and starting to deteriorate that concrete. Here's a piece of concrete that's been very much deteriorated by sulfate attack. Again, you can kind of see all the soil, the grass around it. Again, there's a number of things that we can do as long as we know the soils we have high sulfate-containing soils. Again, I'm not going to bore you with the details, but know that there is a solution and there's a remedy to these situations as well. Again, these are just some of the exposure requirements. Soils can be very corrosive to ferrous metals, the metal pipes. I know you guys sometimes deal with buildings, warehouse structures. I've learned something over the years in dealing with a lot of these calls. I always get the call Monday morning for some reason. We need you guys to come out. We've had a water leak in our warehouse, and oftentimes it is these fire sprinkler lines. I say, well, let me guess. The building's about 25 to 30 years old. Yeah, how'd you know? Well, after about 25 or 30 years in very corrosive soils, the piping actually ends up, if you can see here, this is actually a fire line for this warehouse structure. There's actually two of them. On the top, it's been well maintained, they've been painted, everything else looks good, but if we actually took out the slab, you can see the pipe below it. Very much corroded, very deteriorated, and this was an 8-inch line that actually ended up having about a 1-inch hole at the bottom of it. And of course, for some reason, the fire lines always leak on a Sunday afternoon. They always break. I haven't figured that one out. I'm sure if I have, I get a lot of money, right? There's no one there. It's a Sunday afternoon. The fire lines break. I don't know, but I've worked on half a dozen of warehouses. Fire line breaks. They always break on Sunday afternoon. So I'm trying to figure out how to make money on predicting this. I haven't figured that out yet. So maybe if I do. Here is that building. Actually, you can see what happens. That water, when that fire line broke, the pressure of that water actually ended up lifting up the building. So here is a bearing wall. Here's another building. There's about 1.5 inch separation. Of course, you can imagine that kind of pretty much tweaked the whole interior of this warehouse, and all that had to get repaired. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about landslides and slope stability issues. I know we have a lot of landslides here in the South Bay, the Palos Verdes, Torrance areas. Well, what happens to a landslide? Well, landslides, essentially what happens is, like you and I, soils are always under the forces of gravity. Gravity's always pulling us down. It can be a depressing thought. Well, unfortunately, soils or gravity's always acting on. So soils, if you're on a hillside or on a slope, they want to get into a more stable condition. They have gravity working on them. And what happens if the conditions are right, you can actually get what's called a landslide. There could be a soft surface, a rupture surface underneath that the material literally moves on top of. And then we end up, of course, with devastating things on top. There's a lot of different types of landslides movement. It's really dependent on the geology. What are the materials underneath the slide in the area? It's going to determine the type of mechanism, the type of slide that occurred. And this is important because if we're looking at landslides and we're trying to repair them, we need to kind of know the geology in order to design and repair this correctly. You guys may remember this photo. This is from the Coldwater Canyon up in Los Angeles in 2007, or I'm sorry, 2005. This is just one huge piece of rock. I guess this could be defined as erosion. Erosion is defined as water moving particles. So I guess technically this is really erosion because this is one particle and it was moved by water. But they ended up actually having to dynamite this. In order to get it, to move it, they actually had to use explosives to break that piece up so that they could get it on trucks and move it out to open up the roadway again. Again, there's different types of landslides. Failures is a big circular failure on a slope. This is called a block failure for obvious reasons, I guess. Real quickly, I want to talk a little bit about a project we worked on down in Oceanside. Oceanside is kind of a hillside area similar to Palos Verdes. And this was a project, a slide that occurred in a residential tract that was about 30 years old. So this slide was in there, and what happened one day, people started to notice a crack in their backyard, and slowly this crack kept starting to get bigger and bigger, and they also saw the soil actually moving. So you can imagine their concern. This is unfortunately one of the houses that was red tagged. You can see this is not an architectural feature, unfortunately. This is the front door. So again, I mentioned when we said soil movement, usually it's not as drastic as this, but you can see all of the doors get out of square, the windows, you can see most of it at those locations. Here the stairway actually literally ripped it away from the wall. They have a split level garage now. Yeah, there was about 2 or 3 feet of movement. Here is the side of that back side of that house. This is the actually carpet in the bedroom right here. So they had about 2 or 3 feet of movement here. So this piece, the corner of the room, used to be connected down here. This is the backyard of the adjacent house. You'll notice the concrete guy did a really good job because look, he's cantilevered out. Here you can actually see how the grass, this little piece of grass fit right up here. It was amazing. This did move relatively slowly over a number of days. You can see the little trash cans still working, even the lawn chairs still sitting there. It's only about, in this part, it was about 6 or 7 feet lower than it was when it first started. This is in the downslope area. Here you can kind of see, some drainage. I wanted to point out there's an area drain here. You guys may see those collect water. Typically, we like to have those vertical. Okay, so the water flows in. We don't want them really sideways. Well, this one actually started that way. What happened? This is what's called the toe of the landslide, or the bottom part of the landslide. This homeowner actually, this is all sod he had just placed, and what happened is as this slide moved, that lower soil just kind of bulged up and just kind of bent up. This was a horizontal concrete walkway before, and you can see this soil just kind of bulged. This is the bottom side of the landslide. So, what do we do for landslides? Well, once they move, we want to take a look. We have to really find the rupture surface. Where is the actual material sliding on? Because if we don't know where that is, it's very difficult to fix or repair a landslide. Because if you don't get the rupture surface, no matter what you'll do on top, the slide may still continue to move in the future. And the bigger the slide, the deeper the rupture surface, obviously the more difficult it is to stabilize or do some types of repair. So how do we evaluate it? Well, we send a geologist down the hole. And I say that because, we have a geologist in the room? That's good. Personally, again, this is just my opinion, engineers are too smart to actually go down. These guys, but again, to give the geologists credit, they're much braver than I. Here you can see these guys, this is a drill. We drill usually 24 to 36 inch diameter hole, and then they have a cage and they actually stick these guys, they send them literally down the hole. And what they're doing is they're looking for that change in the geology along the side of this hole to tell us about the landslide. Now, some of our geologists have downhole logged, holes that are down, over 100 feet, 150, 160 feet deep. And when they're down that low, it usually takes them 3 or 4 hours that they're down there. And like I said, I guess, to